Chapter 18 is focusing on the forward march towards the Civil War. We are going to look at a continuation of the struggle between the North and the South between 1848 and 1854. In 1848, we see the election once again between the Democrats and the Whigs. The Democrats nominated Lewis Cass, whose focus or his platform was on popular sovereignty. Now, popular sovereignty, this is the idea that the people out in the territory should be able to choose whether or not their territory is a slave territory or a free soil territory. Basically, this is a sneaky way for the Democratic Party to get around having to actually make this decision on their own. Both the Democrats and the Whigs are national parties, so they have to appeal to both Northern and Southern Democrats or Northern and Southern Whigs. And so by saying popular sovereignty, the Democrats don't have to take a stand one way or another over whether or not slavery should be expanded into the territories. And this is going to continue on later with other people within the Democratic Party. The Whig candidate in 1848 was Zachary Taylor. He was the hero of Buena Vista from the Mexican-American War. Now, the Whigs chose Zachary Taylor for no other reason other than he is a war hero, and everyone knows who he is. In fact, Zachary Taylor had never held a political office before. He'd only voted for president one time, but none of that matters because they didn't really talk about platform issues in 1848. People voted for Zachary Taylor because of who he was, not necessarily for what he stood for. Now, Zachary Taylor was a Southern Whig, and he actually owned slaves, but he never came out one way or another saying whether or not he thought that slavery should expand into the territories to the west. This is going to be a hot-button issue later on. And then finally, there was a third party formed for the 1848 election, the Free Soil Party, who were angry that neither of the two national parties were taking a hard stance one way or another over the expansion of slavery into the territory. So they nominated former President Martin Van Buren as their presidential candidate. And the thing that they had in common, this huge group of supporters, was that they all viewed the expansion of slavery into the territories as a bad thing, for whatever that reason is. Zachary Taylor ended up winning the election of 1848, and they didn't actually discuss a single issue. Here you see the campaign posters for each side, Millard Fillmore being Zachary Taylor's running mate. And he's actually going to assume the responsibilities of the president when Zachary Taylor died in office. Now, very quickly after the end of the Mexican-American War, there was gold discovered in California. Now, remember, California is just recently acquired. It's not even a territory yet because it is so new to the Union. But when gold is discovered by Sutter's Mill in California, massive amounts of people flood into California. And these are not, fine, upstanding citizens flooding into California. These are gold-crazy people who maybe are trying to strike it rich, are trying to escape issues that they've had back east, whatever the reason. But there is a definite need for law and order in California because it is a lawless land and there are a lot of people now. This government was unable to deal with the number of people there. They needed to become a state very, very quickly because with statehood comes a whole infrastructure of law and order. And so in 1848, the people of California applied to the U.S. Congress, or I'm sorry, 1849, these people applied to the U.S. Congress for statehood, and they wanted to apply as a non-slave or free soil state to completely avoid the territorial stage that usually comes between acquisition and statehood. And secretly, Zachary Taylor was pushing California to do this, and this is why many Southern Whigs felt betrayed. Zachary Taylor, while he was a slave owner, did not believe in the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. And this issue had never come up during the election because all people cared about was the fact that he was a war hero. So Zachary Taylor pushing California to become a non-slave state and actually hinting as well that New Mexico would soon follow suit. Now, for Southerners, this is a huge problem for them because they are worried that a free soil California is going to tip the scales in the U.S. Senate in favor of the free soil states and give them more power, but it's also going to set a dangerous precedent for the other territories that are going to be carved out of the Mexican cession. Many Southerners fought in the Mexican-American War with the hope of acquiring this territory and expanding slavery. Their fear was that that was slipping through their fingers at this time. Here you see one of these 49ers, these gold rushers that go to California in 49 to look for gold. And you see where those gold mines were placed. Once again, some 49ers panning for gold. This is going to be a common theme from now until the Civil War, these angry Southerners. In 1850, there is a balance of power within the United States between slaveholding states and free soil states. The South had a majority of justices on the Supreme Court. They had a lot of Southerners in the president's cabinet. The president himself was a Southerner, even though he was advocating for a free soil California. But when you look at Congress, they were outnumbered in the House of Representatives. Remember, the House is based on population to some degree, and so the more populous North had the majority in the House. But in the Senate, there were 15 free states and 15 slave states. So the balance of power was very tenuous in the Senate. Adding California would have tipped the scales even further in the direction of the North. And adding to that, the fear that New Mexico and Utah would soon follow as a non-slave holding state really worried the Southerners. Also at this time, Texas, which as we know is a state in the Union at this time, is having a border dispute with the territory of New Mexico. Now remember, Texas has already established its southern boundary at the Rio Grande River, but its northern boundary is still in dispute. The Texans were claiming that their territory consisted all the way up to the 42nd parallel. Now, if this had gone through, this would amount to half of modern-day New Mexico. So New Mexico and Texas were fighting over who owned this territory, and you'll see it in a second on the map. Also, Northerners were demanding that the District of Columbia become a free soil territory, which would have very much frightened Southerners because remember, D.C. is right smack dab in between Maryland and Virginia. It would have been like a free soil oasis in the middle of these two slave states, which really scared Southerners. And to add insult to injury, the Underground Railroad was obviously in full swing at this time. Now, not that many slaves actually escaped from the south to the north via the Underground Railroad, this chain of safe houses all the way up to the north and into Canada. But the fact that it was happening and nobody was helping to return these slaves to slavery was really irritating the Southerners. So they were demanding a new fugitive slave law that would require Northerners to take an active part in returning runaway slaves to the South. And even further on this side, the abolitionists, while they are definitely a minority, they are a very, very, very vocal minority that are making a lot of noise at this time about getting rid of slavery. So the South is extremely upset at this time. Here you see the proposed boundary line that Texas was advocating all the way up to the 42nd parallel, which would have given them a substantial amount more territory than they currently have. So at this time, compromise was needed. Southern fire eaters, as they were called, these are very radical pro-slavery advocates, were even demanding secession way back in 1850. And if something didn't happen, we could have had a civil war right here in 1850. The Union was not ready for civil war in 1850. We needed the next 11 years in order to cement the Unionist cause. Who knows what would have happened had the South seceded in 1850. Lucky for the Union, right in the middle of this huge controversy, President Taylor died, and his vice president, Millard Fillmore, took over. Now, Millard Fillmore, even though he is a Northerner, he is much more open to compromise. He realizes that compromise was needed in order to save the Union in 1850. And so working with the three giants of the Senate, which would be Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, they brought about the Compromise of 1850. Now, the Compromise of 1850 is not one law. It is a series of laws passed during the 1850 session that calmed the situation down to ensure that the Union stayed tied together for a couple more years. Now, here's what the Compromise of 1850 said. California would be admitted as a free state. Down in New Mexico, New Mexico would gain that disputed territory, but in return, Texas would receive $10 million for it. The slave trade would be abolished in D.C. Now, if you were a slave owner in D.C., you could keep your slaves, but you were not allowed to bring more slaves in to D.C. after that. And for the rest of the Mexican cession, they would apply the theory of popular sovereignty to allow the people living in the territory to decide whether or not to be a slave territory or a free soil territory. And the one thing that the South really got that was 100% on their side was a new fugitive slave law, a much stronger fugitive slave law of 1850, which we'll talk about in a second. But the fugitive slave law of 1850 put the responsibility on every Northerner to try to return runaway slaves to the South, that you could be held legally responsible if you did not act out and try to return slaves to the South. So this is going to be a real issue up north. Now, after the Compromise of 1850 was finally settled, the North obviously got the better end of the bargain. The South got a couple things here and there, but let's be real. The only thing that they got 100% on their side was this new fugitive slave law of 1850. But immediately we see instant reaction against this fugitive slave law up north. Northerners are extremely upset, even moderates are extremely upset over the parts of this fugitive slave law. People who are deemed to be runaway slaves or potential runaway slaves will be taken to court. Now, African Americans were not allowed to testify in court in order to defend themselves. If the judge found that this African American was in fact a runaway slave, he would be paid $10 versus $5 if he deemed him to be a free African American. And all white people of the North were required to help return slaves to slavery. If you did not actively help, meaning you just turned a blind eye or you just didn't participate, you could be held legally responsible with a fine or even jail. So many northern states, Massachusetts as a prime example, chose to nullify the fugitive slave law, saying that they would not follow this, that they refused to follow it. This only added to the bitterness that the South felt, that the one thing that they got from the Compromise of 1850 was being largely ignored by the North. But, like I said before, it is absolutely critical that the Union stayed together for the next 11 years. Who knows what would have happened if the South had tried to secede in 1850? The South needed this next decade to acquire a larger population, to grow its industrial base, and to add to its wealth, which were going to be absolutely necessary for winning the Civil War. Here you see a poster that was put up in Boston warning the African Americans of Boston that slave catchers are among them. And here you see where we are at, geographically speaking, what is free soil, what is slave, and what is still to be determined by popular sovereignty in 1850. And here you see where the legal status of slaves were from the Revolution all the way up to the Civil War. Okay. In 1852, Franklin Pierce was elected president. Franklin Pierce, he was considered a dark horse by his party. He was a Democrat. Not a lot was known about Franklin Pierce, but he absolutely was a Southern sympathizer. Even though he was a Northerner, he was a Southern sympathizer, and he named several Southerners to his cabinet, including Jefferson Davis as Secretary of War. Jefferson Davis from Mississippi will later go on to become the President of the Confederate States of America. Many people even argue that that Franklin Pierce was a puppet to these Southerners, that he just did whatever they wanted to. So to the South now, they are looking to expand slavery into new territories. Well, the West is kind of already starting to close up based on the Missouri Compromise, based on this idea that California is closed, New Mexico is headed that way to a free soil, so where better to go than Latin America? So many pro-slavery advocates in the South start looking to Latin America as a possible way to expand, that it's their manifest destiny to expand not only from coast to coast, but possibly pole to pole, and bring with them slaves and obviously gain more political power. One possible area that they were looking in Central America was through Nicaragua, that there had long been this discussion about building a canal through Nicaragua. This is going to be an issue for a while, and we'll talk about that in a second. They also looked to Cuba as another possible place to go, which we'll also talk about in a second. But looking at Nicaragua, a Southerner by the name of William Walker. Now, this is not the U.S. government. This is just a regular American citizen using his own money and organizing an army, led an invasion into Nicaragua. Seizing control of the Nicaraguan government in 1856. He then declared himself president and promptly legalized slavery in Nicaragua. Now, obviously his goal is to seize control of this territory and eventually be annexed by the United States. The United States took no formal position on this in 1856, but in 1860, a coalition of Central American countries organized an army and overthrew William Walker and had him executed, because their fear was that if they come after Nicaragua and are able to take over, who's to say that our country won't be next? Now, other than William Walker, the British were also kind of worried about what was going on in Nicaragua as well. They felt that the United States was beginning to monopolize trade with Central America, and especially if they seized control of Nicaragua as well, that this would be another country closed to trade with them. And so the British placed an army in Greytown, Nicaragua, which would have been part of the proposed canal route. The Americans saw this as a clear violation of the Monroe Doctrine, the fact that Great Britain is coming over and implanting an army in the Western Hemisphere. So in order to avoid war, the United States and Great Britain signed a treaty, the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, that said neither the U.S. or Great Britain would seize control over a territory that could become a canal in the future. Now, obviously, this is not going to continue because eventually the Panama Canal was built, but this helped to avoid war over the issue of Nicaragua. And then last but not least, in order to expand our commercial interests overseas, the American Commodore Matthew Perry, brother to Oliver Hazard Perry from the War of 1812, took his warships in 1854 over to Tokyo, Japan, to, quote, open trade with Japan, basically opening up what had long been an isolationist country in order to require them to trade with the United States. Here you see where the proposed canal route was through Nicaragua and where the British agents were set up. And here you see a picture depicting Commodore Matthew Perry's arrival in Tokyo.